Hello, I am responding to the claim physician-assisted suicide is the only solution to patients whose conditions are unbearable and cause them intolerable pain. So their claims, secondary claims going over them is the first, knowing the option to end their life makes the patient feel better. The second secondary claim I'll be skipping because it was unclear. The third secondary claim is people decide on this for the most part with a clear mind, and they just want control over their last days. So their first secondary claim, knowing that the option exists to end unbearable pain makes the patient feel better. This is not always the case because knowing the option exists may make the patient feel as a burden, and they will make them feel obligated to go through with it, and instead of having their family take care of them. And nearly 1 out of 2 cited concerns of patients who went through with this operation, or the procedure. They cited a concern of being a burden on family/friends as a reason for requesting assisted suicide. This contradicts the evidence as well. The quote used by the advocate reads, "Patients fear the loss of autonomy, inferring that assisted suicide gives them a sense of control, but in reality the pressure and fear of being a burden on the family and friends can make them feel like they have lost all autonomy." Their secondary claim is again unclear, so I'm going to skip going over that. The third and final secondary claim is that people decide on this with a clear mind because they just want to have control over their last few days. However, evidence proves that this otherwise. It is found that 79% of cases, there is no physician present at the time of ingestion of the lethal dose. And the reason for this is to give the family private time for their last couple moments with their families. But in, again, 79% of cases, there's no doctors or physicians present at the time of ingestion. So for all we know, some of the patients could not be taking the pill themselves. They could, maybe what if they backed out last minute and the family says, no, you're going through with this, and they just put it in their mouth. So we don't really know how much autonomy is really there. And the proof of absolute autonomy is not present. In conclusion, the patients will not always feel better with the option of assisted suicide. They may feel obligated, they may feel pressured to choose this. This, as well as the fact that there's hardly any proof that these patients have complete autonomy over these decisions, is why assisted suicide is a faulty and sketchy procedure. And also, I wanted to go over the claim and the wording more directly. The wording makes the argument vulnerable, and the claim reads that assisted suicide is the only solution to the problem, and this makes the argument weak by default because it just gives it invalid, because just giving one other solution invalidates it in entirety. For example, some other solutions include just dying naturally or being heavily medicated up until death. And that is it. Thank you.
All right, well, you identified the advocate's claim and the secondary claims, except the second one, which you said you couldn't really quite make out what was going on. I don't know if that's because you couldn't hear it in the presentation or because it's not clear in the outline. Either of those is problematic. I don't know how important it was to the advocate's argument, but if it was important and you don't have a response, I think that's a little bit On the first point, it sounded like you were citing evidence that said 1 out of 2 suggested that they had concerns about being a burden. If there was a source citation on that, I don't think you presented it. It sounded like you were trying to give us some evidence to respond to that particular point, but there's no citation of evidence on that point, and that's a little bit problematic. And then the argument about autonomy, where you're suggesting that it's really people are likely to be pressured in this situation, that's mostly asserted, and I think that there's probably a reason to believe that there might be some pressure, but you need to explain it a little bit more, and any examples would be helpful in those circumstances, especially if you have examples of people in places in the world where they have options for assisted suicide. If there has been this kind of pressure, I think that would respond well to your point. The second point you basically skip. Hopefully it's not relevant. The third point, the fact that a doctor isn't present 79% of the time is an interesting piece of information, although I think that that's one of the things that, it's not a doctor who's putting you down, you're putting yourself down, basically. That's why it's, physician-assisted death, not physician-caused death. It's not euthanasia. And the question of why we need to have a doctor present isn't really discussed, except that you've got this hypothetical that maybe somebody wants to back out and the people surrounding them say no, and they're shoving pills down their throats. That's kind of an extreme hypothetical example, and without any suggestion that there's a reason why that would be true or any illustration of it being true, I think you're asking us to accept a lot under these circumstances. I think there might be some evidence that suggests that people, they don't choose this option even though they get the option because they either are fearful or because they decide that it was really not. They weren't in all the kinds of pain that you were talking about that they were talking about anyway. I think you've got an interesting argument that you make at the end that probably would have been more useful at the beginning, suggesting that there are alternatives and then offering some proof on those alternatives. For example, dying naturally. If people can die naturally without the fear that is going along, without the loss of autonomy, you need to explain how that could be done. And the same sort of thing with medication. In other words, if the source of the problem is pain and suffering, if people can be medicated out of their pain and suffering, then they don't have a need to have physician-assisted suicide to address that issue. I think that's the way that argument needed to be developed, and it's a little bit underdeveloped here. All right, thank you.